Once upon a time, there was no earth, only a vast realm of water below and sky above. The first people lived above the sky, where they could not live on water. One day, the sky opened up, and through the hole fell a beautiful young woman and a tree. Two swans swam over to her, gently lifted her onto their backs, and took her to the great turtle. Turtle called all animals to a council, and when gathered in a circle, he told them of the woman fallen from the sky and the tree with earth on its roots. He commanded them to bring up the tree from the water and plant it on its great back so that the woman could live there. After two unsuccessful attempts by otter and beaver to retrieve the tree, muskrat dove down and stayed down for a very long time. When he surfaced, he came up with a tree and a mouthful of earth, which he spat out onto Turtle's back. There the tree grew, bending down one of its branches to root in the earth. And from this branch sprang the first man, who together with the woman would bring forth future generations of people on Turtle Island. And I just love this origin story, this creation myth so much because it really reflects all of the work that I believe GrowHouse is trying to do. I love the fact that woman is first. And I love the fact that she co-conspires with nature, with flora and fauna to create a space where life can thrive. And it's that sort of, co-creation with nature that I really want to cultivate as part of Grow House and the work that we do. So I thank you for acknowledging the Lenape with me. And I invite you to add whose land you're on right now. If you want to throw that in the chat, that would be really, really helpful. So I'll go ahead and share my screen now. Let's get this going. I want to make sure I have the right thing open. All right, perfect. Here we go. Can everyone see my screen? Thumbs up if you can. All right, perfect. So once again, my name is Shanna. The name of the organization I co-founded with my son Warner is called GrowHouse. And we named it because at the time that we were incubating the idea, we were in the middle of Bed-Stuy, which was rapidly gentrifying and still is at that time. And it felt almost illegal for he and his friends to just be hanging out on our stoop. It felt like, when they came inside my home, they had a safe space to grow and thrive and experiment. And that's how the name Grow House came to be. So, as you mentioned in the intro, we're a community development cooperative. We've now moved to a cooperative model, and our aim is to empower Black people and our allies to develop our neighborhoods, often all throughout New York, throughout the United States. Actually, development happens top down. And we believe that everyone designs on a day-to-day basis, and the people who live in neighborhoods should be the ones designing them. Our vision is for Black communities to be connected and thriving as well as sovereign. And so our aim is to create spaces and experiences where people across ages, across generations, across ethnicities can learn and grow together. And we hope that in doing that, we're able to build the relationship capacity for us to steward land together and collectively. So as I mentioned, on the left, there's some images of the original grow house. This was an unfinished space in Brownstone where we lived, and my son and his friends basically took it over. They were able to create an experimental film in that space, and what we realized was a lot of them were not in school or working at the time, and we decided to experiment and play with ideas that we could use to create a gap year for Black youth specifically. And so that is when our travel began. We went to Cuba in 2018 with a group of 10 people. across generations. We had folks from 18 to 70 go to Cuba with us. And then we went to Ghana in 2019. And our Ghana trip was really just focused on young people. And we spent 2 weeks in Ghana, about 2 weeks. And there we met with young people there who were doing very similar things. They were using art, technology, and media to imagine new worlds in Accra. And we've still been in touch with them to this day. We had plans in 2020 to go to Benin and Togo as well as Ghana, but as you all know, the pandemic hit. And so we weren't able to go anywhere. And we took that time to kind of think about what it would mean for that kind of transformative experience to be at home. And how could we do that? We came up with the idea of, collective ownership of real estate. It's great when artists, especially Black artists, make neighborhoods cool, but unfortunately, what ends up happening is they get pushed out of those neighborhoods that they made cool. All the graffiti art ends up on people's Instagrams who have no real connection or like love for the neighborhood. And those creators get pushed into other neighborhoods and lose that connection to community. So we were like, okay, how can we stop this collective ownership of real estate? And that's when we started researching certain models that could be used to collectively steward land and other assets. And we began to move from a corporation to a cooperative model. So that said, what's happening in New York for us, it feels very, very crucial to get our work off the ground. We don't have a property yet that we own, but in 2025, in the spring, we are planning on doing a crowdfunding, our first crowdfunded property acquisition. And that's because right now, like neighborhoods that were once historically Black, like Bed-Stuy used to be 80% Black, are now less than 50% Black. And we're hoping that we can stem the tide of the Black exodus out of our neighborhoods and do that through collective ownership. So we've been studying, like I mentioned, for about 4 years. We've been working with a team of lawyers at CUNY, which is the City University of New York. We've been working with technical assistance providers to come up with a model. And this month we got our 501c3. So I'm really excited about that. We can actually start to receive donations. But we have 3 major initiatives. One is the acquisition of property, which I mentioned. The second is testing out ways to own together, and we have 2 structures that we're going to use to do that. And then the third would be to reintroduce travel and start to work on building out the gap year, which is what we originally wanted to do. So I'll pause there. And as I pause, I wanted to ask you all a question. How do you define community? If you want to drop that in the chat, that would be interesting just for me to see and read out. And I'll look now and see what was posted here. Someone is calling in from Wampanoag. Most folks are in Boston. Tiara says she's in the land of the Mohegans. Okay, awesome. Nipmuc. Is that the indigenous people who were the stewards of the land, Susan? The Nipmuc? Okay. In any case, please share, what does community mean to you? If you wouldn't mind. And hey, Dina, good to see you. Anyone? People living cooperatively in the same area. Okay, Gio says. Hmm. A group of people living in the same place or a group of people with shared ideas, struggles, and culture. Yeah, collective visions and action, and stewardship of each other's healthy living. I love that. And as people are putting their answers in the chat, um, I'm wondering what is easiest about being in community for you? If you want to just put that in the chat as well. So Abdul says collective visions and action and stewardship of each other's healthy living. Beautiful. Relations of shared values and futures from Max. Okay, Abdul says the kind of vibe this Gwendolyn Brooks home or quote. We are each other's business. We are each other's harvest. We are each other's magnitude and bond. Beautiful. Dina says, easiest part of being in community is feeling home and feeling heard and seen. Yeah, I love all of those. I'm asking this because, one of the things that we've been working on as we started to investigate different structures, ownership structures, was outlining our values and also, trying to anticipate hiccups. So the next part of the question that I'd like for you all to answer, just as crowdsourcing for me, is what's the most challenging about being in community? What's the most challenging thing about being in community? And I'll read, Ciara says, the easiest part of being in community feels like the moments when we can come together. And the challenging parts are disagreement and conflict. Yeah. Yeah. I'll read a little bit long. It says, different needs trying to be met at once can be challenging, especially within scarcity mindsets. Yeah, when conflict feels like us versus them instead of team. Okay. Infighting, disagreements that aren't followed by a solution oriented approach. Misalignment, yes. Easiest, getting to know others at a deeper level. Mhm. Okay. And bearing the weight of other people's unconscious. Woo, that's a word. That's really, really a word. Wow. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we came across in working with our advisory council had to do with a lot of these themes. One was building trust, rebuilding trust. A lot of people shared that in their family they had legacies of, either deed theft, predatory lending, get rich quick schemes. And so it really was going to be about rebuilding the trust between us as a people to know that we can actually cooperatively work together and also manage conflict. Um, so I'm seeing in the chat more answers coming through. Learning how to hold each other up can be both challenging and extremely ultimately rewarding. Harm, navigating violence, and restorative justice. Exactly. Exactly. Um, and so I'm wondering if one person wouldn't mind sharing. I really want Max. You talk about bearing the weight of other people's unconscious. Could you share a little bit more about that? And have you seen any effective solutions for scenarios in which we're dealing with everyone's unconscious? I don't know if you're in a space where you're able to talk. Not, I can continue to move on. Or if someone else wants to talk about it, because I noticed three people agreed. Um, how have you noticed or learned any way to dealing with other people's unconscious? Yeah.
Um, I
Um, yeah, please, Abdul. I was going to call on you.
can
Anyway.
go. Perfect timing. Yeah, I can go, and I can give the context. So I work as a city planner in the city of Boston. So there's a lot of me also trying to kind of think through the perspective of someone who engages with communities, different communities throughout the city, ones that are predominantly Black or communities of color, ones that are predominantly white, and seeing, especially in diverse communities where there's a mismatch of priorities, but people using kind of the proxy of another person's problem for them to kind of
Mm,
uphold the thing that they want to keep that ultimately serves them, but doesn't solve that other person's problem. And
mm,
I think just kind of like that as a narrative that people hold up, it can be very difficult to try to move people out of that per se.
got it. Yeah. I mean, I have recently realized how there are issues, especially when you're dealing with public space, and our society is super diverse. And this whole definition of community, it could be intentional community, but a lot of times we end up in communities just by means of proximity. We have to move into a neighborhood, we end up being in community with people who maybe have different opinions, different ways of dealing and navigating conflict, whether or not they ignore conflict altogether, where, which is when it gets buried in the unconscious, or, it's just different from the way that we do. And so we've spent, I would say, about 2 years going through bylaws and trying to figure out ways that we can anticipate conflict, navigate it, and how do we even define community? And is it okay for us to be in community with people whose definitions are different? We referenced Octavia Butler a lot, in her work Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents. She really makes a strong case for the fact that you can never really know, like in times of hardship and distress, who you're going to end up in community with. So it really is about just figuring out how to be boundaried. I believe this is one of the messages of her work, is how to be boundaried and kind at the same time. A lot of times boundaries, speaking from my own personal experience, it took me a long time to navigate how to create boundaries for myself because of the way that I was raised. First generation immigrant from the Caribbean. I was born female, socialized as a woman, and a lot of that ended up, kind of becoming a space where I didn't know how to say no. And what would then end up happening is I would either dispose of people, which means like just block them off completely, or just not have any boundaries. And so boundaries is really, are really, really important in building community. So I am going to go back to our presentation, but thank you for such thoughtful answers and for sharing and being vulnerable like that. Okay, Max says, thank you. I want to reflect a bit on a specific example, but a potential solution is cultivating self-awareness and tools to manage our internal ish. Yes, 100%. That's not easy either. So I want to go back. So talking about the property acquisition, our goal is in the next 3 years to acquire 3 to 6 properties. We're currently writing a grant with the Environmental Protection Agency, the Community Change Grant, and we hope that we'll be able to get it. And as part of that grant, we're proposing an anchor for our portfolio, which will be the GrowHouse, a community-owned resilience hub that will live within a mixed-use property with space on the bottom that will be, multi-purpose. You could have theater performances in there. It will serve as a space of staging for food distribution in case of climate emergencies, a learning and education center, as well as having a commercial kitchen that can help with food prep and host classes, etc. And then on the top would be both short and long-term residences that will house people from across the African diaspora. As we traveled, we went to Cuba, we met with this man who founded the first Black-owned music production company in Cuba. His name is DJ Higwe. And, he's building a very similar sort of building in Cuba. And he is always back and forth to the United States to be able to house him and have him in community where people can come and learn from him would be amazing. The same thing is true for Ghana. We met so many amazing and talented people in Ghana. We really want to provide this two-way flow of information and resources, talent, struggles, challenges, and solutions across the African diaspora. And so this Resilience Hub would be collectively owned in our new CLT. And we have another structure that we're working on, which is a permanent real estate cooperative, which would be able to provide financial dividends to community residents who buy into the property. So we wanted to create this dual path because, the one thing that we found about community land trust is that collective ownership has its benefits, and yet it's really more difficult to build wealth because Black communities have been iced out of wealth through redlining and historic disinvestment. We feel like it's a part of repair in order, to be able to have Black communities make some money in the real estate market as well without it being completely extractive. So yeah, I just mentioned this. Like ours, part of our vision is really about a flourishing, connected Black world. One of our former advisory council members, Aisha Shillingford, uses this term an archipelago of Black utopias. That is really what we're trying to create, these connected and yet, autonomous zones of freedom for Black people. And so I will stop there and entertain any questions. I think that's the extent of the presentation that I wanted to share with you guys, but I would love for you to ask me questions or share any thoughts. Gio says DJ Higuey is a great artist. Yeah, he got me interested in the Vinyl Fest every December in La Habana. Yes, amazing. Yes, yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Shanna. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about GrowHouse's work with the African Flatbush African Burial Ground, and
Yeah,
how you see that connecting to like this broader theme of building Black worlds.
100%. So we have been, oh, my earbud fell out. Hold on. So a little bit of the origin story with Flatbush African Burial Ground. During 2020, during the pandemic, as we started to think about, oh, what would it mean to collectively own real estate? We started looking for city-owned property in New York. Some of these agencies have lots that they've been holding on to that aren't developed. They're kind of eyesores in the community. And we found this empty lot. It looked like an empty lot. And then when we looked at this request for qualifications that Housing Preservation and Development had put out around the lot, we started digging through and we realized that it was an African burial ground in the heart of Flatbush. Excuse me. And so our first step was to try to figure out, okay, what's the story on this? When did they find out that this was an African burial ground? We realized that it has been known for a while. It was actually on, I think, 1852 maps listed as an African burial ground. A school was built on top of it, which was ultimately demolished, and then it just sat empty. There were even archaeological studies done on the site that were not released to the public, and remains were extracted from the site and removed without any sort of public input. And it was at that point that, we decided, okay, we originally thought that this could be a development site for us, or that maybe we could bid on becoming a subcontractor in some way for the housing development that was being proposed. But we realized it was a travesty. Like that would never happen to any other cemetery in the way that it happened. It was because it was an African burial ground, that it was being treated with such disrespect. And so at that point, we reached into our artist community because we started out first as an artist collective. We reached out and we started to figure out, okay, this fence is just unactivated. How can we let people know that it's an African burial ground? It sits at a corner where there are two bus stops, and there are lots of people walking by. And when we would ask people, do you know what this lot is? They would say, no, we have no idea what it is. Oh, there used to be a school here, but we don't know what happened. We would see people throwing trash over the fence into the African burial ground. And what we ended up doing was a fence weaving, and the fence weaving was part of a project called the Global Fence Weaving Project. And they asked us to select a couple lines from Asada Shakur's poem called The Leftovers, What is Left? And we chose two lines. Truth is my compass and love is my sword. And we wove that using 4-inch ribbon into the fence. And then on top of it, we put Flatbush African Burial Ground so that people could not deny that this was a burial ground. Now, how I see this fitting, all of this fitting into GrowHouse's um, mission is reclaiming Black spaces, right? This was an ancestral space that was being desecrated. I believe that spaces like that, especially in a space like New York, in a city like New York, where cultural economy is a big part of what draws people there. People come every year because of hip hop, because of graffiti, because they want to experience the edginess of New York. That edginess was created by Black people. I thought it would be interesting to experiment with that space as a site of pilgrimage and a way to engage in public dialogue around, okay, what is the legacy of enslavement in Brooklyn? A lot of people didn't know that Brooklyn was a slave state. I mean, it was a slave city, and that New York was a slave state. A lot of people didn't know that approximately 70 to 80% of white folks in Flatbush specifically, but in Brooklyn as a whole, owned at least one enslaved person or held one enslaved person in captivity. A lot of people didn't know the extent of slavery's influence on New York's economy. So we really wanted to make it a space of public dialogue around, okay, how do we get people talking about this history in public space? How do we get people talking about this as a through line to gentrification? How do we get people talking about this in a way that disrupts shame? I think a lot of people don't talk about the history of racism in our country because it is very shameful. And as opposed to dealing with the shame, people would rather just ignore it and go about their day. And for young people, specifically of African descent, we found that they were like ashamed of their ancestors for being enslaved. And, you know, what I set about in doing the walking tours was just showing how much resistance actually happened. Like there wasn't a day that passed that Black people were not resisting our bondage. And to reframe it where young people would feel comfortable, would feel confident, would feel proud of being descendants of enslaved people because, you know, as Nicole Hannah Jones said, we have perfected this democracy. We have been the perfecters of the democracy. And whenever we win, everybody wins. So how do we allow young people to step into that? And so, you know, I think part of where I would love to see the African burial ground fit into our portfolio, we tried really hard for it to become a part of a CLT, so that community could steward it together. The city council had other plans for it, but we felt like the CLT model would be perfect because it requires a tripartite board. You need community residents to be on that board. You can have technical assistance providers on that board and the users of the space. We were, you know, proposing the descendant community be the third part of the board. So that way it's truly democratic and it's shaped by community residents. But, you know, they had different plans for it and we're still working towards trying to figure out how we can collaborate, even though it's been rough going. Someone mentioned the chat violence. I have been subject to violence organizing at that site, like physical violence. And so it's just been one of those really challenging projects. So that's a long answer to your question. I hope it answers your question, but feel free to clarify a little bit more with more questions if you'd like, and I'll check the chat. Central Park was once a graveyard, I heard. Yeah, Central Park was, you know, Seneca Village lived inside of Central Park, which was a Black free settlement. And they did have a graveyard for Black people inside of Central Park, but it was destroyed, you know, eminent domain. They wanted to build a park, so they used eminent domain to create Central Park. Max says that perfect example of bearing the weight of others unconscious. It's not our shame that we carry, it's white shame, which they are unconscious of or semi-conscious of. Yeah, exactly. Did that answer your question, Ciara? A little bit more, yeah. Go ahead, Gio. Sure.
Yeah, really wonderful presentation. Wait, is anyone able to hear me? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right. I wanted to ask a question. Earlier you said a question about the cooperative that now exists. I wanted to ask earlier in your presentation you mentioned that you transitioned to a cooperative after being another structure, and I'd like to know what resources were central for that transition to happen. I'm sure there were many factors and resources, including people power, but I would like to know if there were any other resources that you could name you know, that were like, that's like the lifeblood of that transition?
Yeah. So we took part in Lift Economy. They have a Next Economy MBA program, which is an amazing resource, and they have this fantastic spreadsheet. My mind was blown when I saw all of the list of resources that they had. And so, oh, you're in that program. Yeah, they're amazing. Um, and then there was this website called communitywealth.org, I believe it is. And they had a workbook around developing cooperatives. And in it, they had different ways of becoming vested in a cooperative. Right now, we're a cooperative of two, myself and my son Warner. However, we have our advisory council set up on a track that after being on the advisory council for 2 years, going through our political education, building community with each other, they will be able to transition into becoming members of our cooperative. Anyone who's hired would go through a similar process where they would be vested after 2 years of working with us and being a member of our cooperative with all the decision making powers that that entails. So yeah, Lift Economy was central in us making a shift. We Yeah, it was a fantastic program, and I recommend it to anyone.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. How are you liking the program so far, Gio?
Yeah. So I like it a lot because I get to ask questions that a lot of finance and economic folks pretend not to know the answers to here in Boston. People are more honest and forthcoming with advantages and disadvantages of pursuing a solidarity economy. As our post-capitalist, lifeline, pretty much. So some things that stood out to me was, just like I asked a question a couple weeks ago in the office hours, like, just more about cooperatives where people can also live near or around the area they work, so it's
Mm,
like a full communal experience where your sustenance, is essentially being grown, pretty close to where you live. So, like shelter, um, communing with the land in a respectful and sustainable way. So yeah, just really glad that resources like that are regularly talked about in the Lift Economy Next Economy course, which is an unaccredited MBA, but it has plenty of street cred with Ujima.
yeah. Um, you something you said made me think about one thing I wanted to lift up that isn't in our presentation yet. Um, is about, we struggled really early on in 2017 when we first formed because we had this like vision document with all these things in it. We wanted to have interconnected spaces that were collectively owned, from community farms to residences to a commercial district to arts programming and cultural programming. And when we first started to like go out to funders to get funding, they were like, "Oh, you're doing too much." So we shrank our mission down to really focus on art. And for a while, we experienced almost like a mission drift where we were doing things that were focused just on art, which we love, but we weren't really feeling the fullness of our vision come to life. And we started to doubt that we could even do it. But now, 7 years in and writing this EPA grant, we're talking about, stewardship of rain gardens and tree beds and transforming those into like a green corridor that's, beautified with art. And we've actually begun to do some of that work. We're talking about, what it could look like to have a climate resilience hub and a residence in one space so that, people can study mycology, they can study all kinds of things that most people in our community aren't really exposed to, but could be an income generator for us as a community. So Next Economy gave us, I think, the go ahead, like being in in a room with people who were doing really interesting things and trying things out. Like, okay, we can do this too. Like, why not just try? And if you fail, okay, you try again, you iterate, you know? I'm seeing in the chat, I'm gonna find the website because I think they did change the URL, but there's like a document in there that was like a guide to developing worker-owned cooperatives. And then we had conversations with this co-op. Oh my God, the acronym is BCDI, that's what I call it, but it's in the Bronx. And they are doing like they're incubating worker-owned cooperatives. And we had lots of conversations with them about decision making. There's another cooperative here called Brooklyn Supported Agriculture. Yes, that's it. Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative. Um, there's a worker-owned cooperative that focuses on Black-owned farmers called Brooklyn Supported Agriculture. And we were talking with them, like, what does decision making look like for y'all? Like, what was it like to start? How do you hold accountability? And so, in talking to folks, we felt like, yeah, we can actually attempt to make this work as a cooperative. Let me check what's in the website, what people are putting here. It is Democracy Collaboratives, and they had a resource section. If I can find the workbook, I will share it with Sierra or Arifa so that you guys can take a look at it and see what we use. But in it, it had like a lot of different examples about how people made co-ops work. Yeah, Sierra.
This is kind of tangential, but how can we support GrowHouse?
We just got our 501c3, so we're really, really excited. We haven't opened up the bank account yet for that initiative, but I would say like follow us on socials. That's always helpful. I'll put our Instagram in the chat and sign up for our newsletter on our website. And we'll be sharing in the future like ways to get involved. Whenever we have events, if you're around, like feel free to come through. That's another way of supporting. And yeah, for now, that's kind of where we're at. But if you sign up for our newsletter, once we get everything situated, I would love to share more.
I had a question for you.
Yeah,
I
sure.
feel like there was I feel like in your slide I may have not I wasn't probably meant to see this, but I feel like I saw something that said Black Utopia.
Oh yeah. Yes. So it's okay. We do have this project called the Black Utopia Project. Um, and it's almost like a group of institutions, people, public historians, artists, and we meet monthly to just kind of share and break some of the silos. That's really common in doing work at museums that deal with sensitive history, specifically Black history. And like I mentioned, the whole name Black Utopia Project is inspired by Aisha Schillingford of Intelligent Mischief and Terry Marshall of Intelligent Mischief, their whole idea of creating this archipelago of Black utopias. And so, it started out as an art-based project, and then it evolved into, okay, now how do we bring people together to strategize and figure out ways that we can create an economy around the work that we do as Black people. And, one of the exciting things that we're doing right now is we're planning to expand the walks, the history walks. So I have mine in Flatbush. I've done one in downtown Brooklyn, but we have members of the project who are doing some in Weeksville. Weeksville is the second, I think, free Black settlement in the entire United States that was founded in 1838, and it's in Brooklyn. So someone is developing a tour around Weeksville. We have an abolitionist tour in downtown Brooklyn that kind of tour sites on the Underground Railroad. And then we're working on a food tour which would highlight, foods of the Black diaspora throughout Brooklyn. So I think, with this, we're going to test out what it would look like for us to apply for funding together as these different groups as a way of building a cooperative economic muscle amongst us and see what happens from there. So yeah, the Black Utopia Project, we do happy hours. Sometimes those happy hours are productive. Sometimes it's just us doing karaoke, singing karaoke and being together in community. But yeah, it's been beautiful. So Mary says, I feel like I saw you mention utopia as a verb. Could you speak a little bit about that? Yeah, I try to remember where that is, but it might be on our website. I've heard people speak down on utopias, where they're just like, oh, utopias are a pipe dream. You can't really have a utopia. Oh, utopia is, it's pie in the sky. But for me, it's more of an ethos than it is a thing. I feel like a utopia is constantly evolving and it's something that you have to work towards. And a lot of that work is it came in the answers that you gave, right? How do you consistently show up in community when it's hard? How do you navigate conflict? How do you set boundaries? How do you fail and try again? How do you build rest into your work? How do you work across ethnicities, across races to dismantle, um, white supremacy? How do you look white supremacy in the face and identify it together and decide, we may not have the same path to dismantling it, but we all can work side by side. So yeah, I do believe that it's a verb. Utopia is a verb. And it's something that you never get to. Same thing like, I feel like liberation is one of those things as well. It's constantly being refined. And when you meet one milestone, there's always something else to work on. So for sure. I'm looking in the chat to make sure. Yeah, thank you. That makes so much sense. Yes. Thank you so much for putting this on. And thank you, Shanna, for your time and wisdom. Okay, perfect. Nice to meet you, Abdul. Definitely.
We have a couple minutes left if there are any other questions, comments, reflections, feedback, appreciations. You can feel free to unmute.
Where would one find information about your tours? On our IG page, on our Instagram page. When they happen, we normally post them there and we send them out in our newsletter. I have one more question about travel. Yeah, sure, Gio.
Yeah, you already kind of half answered that. I guess I could go to the social media, but while you're in front of me, I wanted to know, excuse me if this was answered earlier in your presentation. I wanted to know, do you have to be a cooperative member or you're that immediate community to be in these travels, to be in these upcoming travel groups?
No, we like to prioritize people who haven't been to the location that we're going to before. So when we went to Ghana, we number one prioritized folks who didn't have a passport, and as part of the grant, we got everyone their passports and their visas. Um, and then the other thing is some people had been to West Africa or had family that was from West Africa and hadn't, been in a while. That is a priority for us. If they had never been to the country before, that's a priority because it really is about number one, like seeing places with fresh eyes and getting inspiration and then providing opportunity to folks who maybe don't have those opportunities on an ongoing basis. So there is an application process though, once we open up the travel, and there are some orientations that we do that can be virtual. But we've mainly done them in person just to kind of build community with folks who are going to be spending time together abroad. And we've included therapist help, like help from mental health professionals, in terms of traveling abroad can be really challenging, and we try to provide strategies for folks to deal with their own ish, as someone said, and not allow that to spread into other people's, journey. So, yeah. Our next trip we're planning is in 2025. So we'll definitely let y'all know. And now that we're a member of Boston Ujima, you guys will be definitely the first to know. Yeah, sounds like planting seeds of internationalism creates strong minds. Yeah, 100%. And I find that, you know, the young people who went with us to Ghana specifically, they all shared like they felt so much more creative after they came back. When you travel abroad, you just see different sights, you smell different smells, you taste different things, and it really gets the synapses firing in a different way, I think. And also seeing what people were doing in Ghana with less resources, I think, helped folks to think outside of the box and be more creative around, how to monetize things. And so I would say 3 of the 5 photographers that we brought with us who were youth between the ages of 18 and 30 actually now have like consultant, work as photographers. And that was, I think, in response to just being out there and seeing how people are hustling and making things work.